I don't like being in here at night by myself. If there are ghosts anywhere, they would be here.
Prisons and jails built in America in the 1700s and 1800s were gruesome reminders that crime did not pay. In a time when deplorable living conditions walked hand in hand with death and personal tragedy, these institutions of punishment were truly terrifying places that assuredly left deep psychic fissures in this world and the next. The Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was just such a place.
Most prisons before Eastern State was constructed were large open holding cells, and they would put everybody in together. They'd put adults in with children, men in with women, and all types of criminals. So petty thieves would be locked in with murderers, all packed into these large open holding cells. They were incredibly violent, disease-ridden. Sometimes disease would wipe out the entire prison population. There was very little sense that people would be better after they were released.
In response to these wretched conditions, a new type of prison was planned. Built on an elevated cherry orchard just outside Philadelphia, the Eastern State Penitentiary was supposed to be a new and humane way to house prisoners. But in fact, it turned out to be a place of solitude and misery.
In the early years, prisoners at Eastern State lived in extreme isolation. They woke up in their cells, spent 23 hours a day in their cell, went to bed in their cell, and knew almost nothing aside from this small white room. Typical sentence was about 2 years. Inmates were given some kind of simple work to do in their cells and given nothing to read except for the Bible. The majority of them were illiterate anyway. And so, in the early decades of the prison's use, the experience of an inmate would be about surviving isolation. Day in, day out for years at a time with almost no human contact. Spending years in strict isolation can drive a person insane.
Prisoners were housed in small individual cells with no windows and shortened doorways, specifically designed to humiliate an inmate. The only light source in the room came from a single hole cut in the ceiling of the cell, called the Eye of God.
The prison cells at Eastern State were designed like small chapels. They have a high arched ceiling and blank white walls, and the only light comes in from above, and they call it the Eye of God. And so when you're in there, you look up and all you see is this little circle of daylight looking down, and it does look a little bit like an eye. And it's meant to create the impression that you're always being watched, and that even though there's no windows in the room, God is looking down at you through this little point, this little eye above. It's spooky.
The key to the success of Eastern State Penitentiary was the complete isolation of its inmate population. As a matter of practice, prisoners were hooded whenever they were outside their cells. Cells were built with soundproof walls in order to keep the prisoners from fraternizing with each other. For all essential purposes, the inmates were cut off from the outside world, forbidden to see another prisoner for the entire duration of their sentence.
The people who ran Eastern State Penitentiary had a fetish about silence, and so even the guards pacing these corridors wore socks over their shoes to muffle their footsteps, and the carts they used to roll food up and down the hallways had leather over the wheels. They'd roll silently up and down the hallways. Inmates ate in their cells, they slept in their cells. Inmates were only taken out of their cells to bathe about once every 2 weeks, and when they did that, they had their heads covered with a hood with no eye holes. Basically put a bag over their head, so that all the inmate would remember from their time at Eastern State was the 4 walls of their cell.
Silence was strictly enforced at the Eastern State Penitentiary. If a prisoner was caught making any noise at all, they were severely punished. Prisoners who continually broke the rules faced stiffer and stiffer penalties. Over time, the prison's administrators had to resort to more intense forms of punishment to get their point across. Punishments for repeat offenders included the straitjacket, the iron gag, and a particularly hideous contraption called the mad chair.
Most prisons at the time were extremely violent, and inmates who came into Eastern State could expect at first they'd be treated very well. But if inmates committed infractions of the rules at Eastern State, they'd be treated the way they'd be treated at any other prison in the early 1800s, which was with extreme force. Sometimes they would take inmates out into their exercise yards, hang them by their wrists from chains, strip them naked, and douse them with water in the wintertime. There's accounts of one inmate having ice hanging from his beard while he hung naked out in the exercise yards. There was even an inmate named Matthias Macumsey who was consistently making noise, and they couldn't get him to stop, and they put him in a device they called the iron gag. It held his hands behind his back, and a bar went up and into his mouth and put a metal rod against his tongue to keep him quiet. And he struggled against it, and his tongue swelled, and he choked to death. There was an investigation. They looked into it and decided that he'd asked for it, that he had it coming. This was typical for the way prisons were run at the time. Life was cheap in the early 1800s.
If a prisoner survived solitary confinement and had the physical strength to conquer the prison's many torture devices, he had one more demon to defeat, that being disease. The prison's poorly designed heating, plumbing, and ventilation systems worked together to spread the putrid odor of human waste to every nook and cranny of the building. These unsanitary conditions caused outbreaks of illness that ravaged both the inmate population and the guards assigned to maintain order in the prison. Without a doubt, serving time at the Eastern State Penitentiary was a mind-numbing experience. There were many documented instances where prisoners went insane because they could not handle the isolated conditions that were the mainstay of the prison. The Pennsylvania system of punishment at the Eastern State Penitentiary was finally abandoned as it produced very few reformed prisoners.